Okay, welcome to this week's parsha class. This week's parsha is Parashat Vayeira, and I will share the sheet here. Parashat Vayeira has a lot of really interesting, big things that happen in it. We read this parsha not once, but twice over Rosh Hashanah because we read the part about Sarah sending Hagar into the desert with Yishmael, and we also read the Akedah at the end of this week's parsha. And so there were a lot of places that I felt like were sort of the obvious choice to go to in a parsha shir in thinking about these things. But I thought that maybe there was some value towards finding something maybe like a road less traveled. And I also was very intrigued by this idea of how clearly I think that this one example demonstrates the role that midrash can play within Tanakh, which is to say a very, very strong role. I think that I was sitting next to Nahama, and I can't remember if she was saying she did it or someone else did it while she was a teacher in elementary school, that the teacher who taught Tanakh would wear a pair of sunglasses with the lenses popped out. And when she was teaching the parsha, when she taught a midrash, she would put the sunglasses down. And when she started teaching the pshat, the sort of straightforward meaning of the text, she would put the sunglasses on top of her head. And I thought that was brilliant. Because it is so easy to intertwine them. I remember often my father would get frustrated when we would come home on Friday and we would tell him about the parsha, and we would say like, Esav was the most wicked person because he did these things. And he would say, where does it say that in the text, right? And like we would say, no, it says Mora, whoever told us, right? Because it's very easy to get them intertwined. So I want us to look at these two psukim and then to see what the midrash does with them, and see if we like it or we don't like it, if we'd rather, go in some other direction from there. Okay, let me make this a little bigger. So in this week's parsha, right before, oh, Kathy, were you trying to say something? You're muted. Okay, hold on, I'll wait. I might be able to unmute you. Let's see. I can't unmute you because I can ask you to unmute.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. So I've always wondered what the source is when someone says the midrash says, whether, because I know there's some in the Talmud, for instance, and I think, but you help me with this. I think that there's a whole centuries and centuries more of midrashic layers, which would I would find that useful when people do that. I don't know. So the sunglasses would have to have 3 layers or something, because yeah, just how to know how to interpret it, whether it's, just sort of like a legendary thing, which is the way the rabbis are suggesting we think about it, or if it's something really old from Talmud. Do you have any guidance for that? How much of it is from Talmud, for instance?
So not very much. The Talmud does sometimes talk about the Torah, but not often, to be honest. The midrash is a vast and very old set of commentary. In fact, Rashi, who's medieval, right? I don't want to guess which century, but a medieval commentator, he often cites the midrash, often without proper annotation because it wasn't necessary back then. So often when you read Rashi, that is the midrash, basically. The midrash is organized, the sort of like the most middle of the road midrash is organized into rabbas. So there's Breshit Rabbah, Shmot Rabbah, right? So that is a very old collection. I think the oldest one is the midrash, either Buber or Tanhuma. I'm not sure. I could get some dates and sort of reply to the email. But it is I don't know if it's contemporary with the Gemara. I don't want to guess. I'll look. But it is very old, and some of the midrashim are much older than others, is I guess what I would say. And usually it's sort of a collection of rabbis. So sort of similar to the Gemara in some ways. It's written as like a discussion, and we'll actually see that on the source sheet later. But not always actually a discussion in the room. It's more the way it was compiled later, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. I think it's kind of like confusing
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a good point. Like anything, right? When you say like the Gemara says, right? Like, do you mean the Babylonian Talmud or the Jerusalem Talmud? Do you mean, right? Like,
Yeah, from when?
do you mean the Mishnah or the Gemara? Do you, right? Like, and so I think you're right that there's a lot of space. Midrash generally, I do think refers to a time period, and I'll get what which it is, and also a style of sort of taking a pasuk and coloring in the backstory.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so these first two psukim, right, is Vatere Sarah et ben Hagar HaMitzrit asher yalda Abraham mitzachik, right? So Sarah sees the son of the Egyptian child that she had born to Abraham, right, that she and Abraham had together, and he is mitzachik, translated here as playing around. And she is upset. V'tomer Abraham, she says to Abraham, Garesh ha'amah hazot ve'et banah, right? Cast out that slave woman and her son. For the son of that slave, right? Again, sort of right, very much emphasizing that Hagar is the Amah here. Ki lo yirash ben ha'amah hazot im b'ni im Yitzchak, right? For that son of that slave will not share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. So if you were reading this just from the Pshat and you were trying to keep our knowledge of Midrash out of it, I think it would be fair to say that that mitzachek sounds like a nice word, right? The older son is playing with the younger son, maybe distract. It's hard to know how old they are at this point. Maybe it's like a toddler, young child and an older child. Maybe it's an older child and a teenager. But in some way, it seems like he's playing with Yitzchak. But we see from the reaction of Sarah that there must be something else going on there, because Sarah, explodes, cast out that woman. That woman's son will not share in the inheritance with my son. Although I do want to note, this is not my favorite interpretation, but I wanted to sort of bring like each school, because everyone has something to say here, right? Because it's confusing. What does mitzachek mean? Why does Sarah react the way she does? I would say the first way, probably on some level, maybe the most shot level, is the Ibn Ezra says he is acting as boys do. Meneheg kol na'ar, right? What is Sarah's reaction about? She's jealous because he was older, right? That Sarah has a weak spot when it comes to Hagar and Yishmael. She maybe regrets having Hagar join the family in such an explicit way. She maybe regrets that her child is not the oldest child who is assumed to be the inheritor of the covenantal bracha of the Jewish people. And so she reacts out of line, right? I don't like it because it makes me feel like Sarah is just sort of like some hysterical mother, as opposed to one of the four imahot, as opposed to someone with like some gravity to her. But I think that it's a fair read on some level. Then there is the level of the Sforno. And I love the Sforno because this, and this is something that I think is interesting, Kathy, about like the sort of the scope of Midrash, is that the Sforno is operating in a world in which he assumes the Midrash is fact, right? So we'll see that here he says that they're at a mishteh, they're at a big party that Abraham has given, that's part of the text, to mark the weaning of Yitzchak. And it says in that pasuk that he's invited lots of great men. And Rashi says, quoting the Midrash, who are these great men? One of them is Avimelech. And what's so great about the fact that Avimelech, the king of Egypt, is invited to this meal? It's because there was gossip, right? Sarah, just to remind everyone, Sarah and Abraham go down to Egypt. Abraham gets anxious right as they're about to cross the border and says, Sarah, please tell everyone you're my sister, not my wife. Avimelech takes Sarah for one night. Then God sort of steps in and the situation gets remedied and Sarah gets returned. But for one night, she is in the palace. And maybe wantedly or unwantedly, there's been some kind of interaction between Avimelech and Sarah. And when you take a step back, this is a midrash I didn't know. They don't teach you this in elementary school. When I heard it, I thought, oh, that actually makes a lot of sense, right? You take a couple who's in their older age, they've had infertility problems their whole lives. Then suddenly Sarah goes and sleeps with someone who is younger and magically is pregnant. Of course, there were rumors that it was Avimelech's baby. It seems like very scandalous to me, right? Because obviously Yitzchak is the covenantal child, but again, there's like a lot of assumptions that we're making there. So the midrash has come to tell this story. So what I love about this Sforno is that he is just assuming that's true. That at the Mishteh, at the feast, there was a lot of gossip swirling about, oh, they invited Avimelech. Avimelech is probably the father of Yitzchak, right? And that what is the bad thing? What's the mitzachlik that Yishmael is doing, says Sforno? It's he's repeating this gossip that he had heard. Right. So let's assume maybe he's a little bit older. He's a teenager, and I may be the only one on the call who has not yet raised a teenager, but I have been one, and I know that they know exactly how to push the buttons at exactly the right time, right? Like twist the knife in. And so that's what Yishmael is doing. If he's really, let's assume he's a teenager, he sees that Sarah is very insecure in her role, right? We know that Hagar has sort of risen up in her status in the family, and Yishmael is the oldest. The promise of children as numerous as the sand and the stars is given to Abraham, not to Sarah. And so Sarah might feel nervous that she jumped the gun, right? If only she had waited and there was no Yishmael, then Yitzchak would of course be the covenantal child, but maybe Yishmael is the covenantal child. And Yishmael knows exactly how to twist the knife in and say, oh, you're worried about you should be worried about his patrilineal heritage also, right? Maybe he's not Abraham's son at all. Forget second son. And so that is sort of what makes her explode. So I love the Sforno because it plays into the world of the midrash, and also because, right, almost as though it was, he doesn't say the midrash said Sarah must have been pregnant by Avimelech, and also because I think it gives sort of like a psychological understanding of the pain Sarah must be in at that moment, right? That's why she reacts so strongly, because of that. So those are two options. Either some kind of gossip that really hurts Sarah's feelings, or perhaps just sort of, run-of-the-mill behavior that makes Sarah jealous.
Question.
Yeah, please.
Does a concubine children have the same rights of inheritance as would the wife of the husband?
Yeah, it's a great question. It comes up again with Yaakov, right? Because he has two concubines, Zilpah and Bilhah. Neither of them have the first child, so it's a little hard to know. But it seems likely that that he would, and mainly maybe because Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham, like as a second wife, maybe almost, right, in her stead on some level. But I think that by the time of the Gemara, like as they're codifying these family laws, then that's no longer true. The concubine's son wouldn't have the same status, but I believe at this moment, there's no reason for Sarah not to believe that.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. I think, we'll see a lot of this sort of repeat when it comes to Yitzchak's children, who are both children of the wife, right? Esav and Yaakov. But I think that here, I think that that's why God gives Yishmael this bracha of being a great nation sort of outside of Abraham, is that there's some feeling like maybe he was owed it on some level, that he was the oldest child and he was getting cut out of this covenant.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question, as usual. Very good questions. So both of these commentaries, though, I think imagine Yishmael as like a sort of normal guy. And we're going to see in the Tosefta Sota, which is an older midrash, that was not always the case. And this is actually, if we looked at Rashi sort of sums this up very succinctly, but I think there's something interesting in the interplay here. So the text opens with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai telling us that there are 4 places where he and Rabbi Akiva disagree with each other over the meaning of a verse. And so he says one of them is in fact our verse here. Right, that's the first paragraph. And so Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is going to tell us what Rabbi Akiva thinks. So he says, Rabbi Akiva said, Ein tzchok ha'omer kan ela avodat kochavim. This is avodah zara. is what he's saying, right? Yishmael was doing some kind of avodah zarah, and his proof comes from the time of the golden calf in Shmot Lamed Aleph, where it says, right, the people made the golden calf. They went to Aaron, they fashioned it out. They collected their gold. They fashioned the golden calf out of the gold, and then they sit down to eat. V'yakumu litzachik, and they got up to be merry. Right. And that, I think we understand there is like to dance around the golden calf or to have some kind of frivolous behavior there. And so that is Rabbi Akiva's proof that Yishmael's grave sin that got him cast out by Sarah is to be someone who did avodah zarah. And in fact, older versions of the midrash have these sort of stories about like grasshoppers being offered on altars, right? Like some kind of child's form of avodah zarah. Okay, so that's pretty bad, right? Then Rabbi Yossi Haglili is quoted as upping, I would say, the ante, right? He says, "Ein tzchok ha'amar kan, ela gilui arayot." No, the word tzchok here means sexual perversion. And his proof text comes from later in Breshit, which is when Yosef, who had been captured by the Midianites and sold down to Egypt, right, is working in Potiphar's home. We learn that Potiphar's wife liked Yosef. He was very beautiful. And she made an advance on him and he ran away, right? And in her anger, she says, Ba Elai ha'eved, right? That Yosef came to fool around with me, litzachik bi, to fool around with me. Right. And so therefore, Yishmael's crime was something of a sexual nature, either maybe something inappropriate to Yitzchak or demonstrating some kind of inappropriate behavior in front of Yitzchak. But that's his proof there. Right. And so far, these are fair proofs, I think, right? That's a very common technique to figure out what a word means in context, is to look where it occurs in other places where it's clearer, right? So Rabbi Akiva is saying, oh, it clearly means avodah zarah, and Rabbi Yossi Haglili is saying it clearly means gilui arayot. Here is where I would say we see the midrash start to run off the rails. Rabbi Yishmael, super interesting name, right? Talking about a Yishmael, named Yishmael, says, Ein lashon tzchok, ela shfichat damim. This is about killing someone, about murder. And here, his quote is from the Navi, which is fine, that happens. But if you note here it is, Vayischaku lefanenu, is with a shin, not a tzadi, right? So he's actually taking more of like a homonym than the actual verb. So vayischaku lefanenu, they made sport before us, is not vayitzchaku, but vayischaku. And so already it's starting to fall apart a little bit, but Rabbi Yishmael is saying, no, this is about murder. So those are three options, right? And before we read Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's critique and his own offering, right? If we step back for a moment, these three sins share a common theme. Anyone know what it is? Extra credit. They are the three sins listed as cardinal sins in the Masechet Sanhedrin, in the Gemara, right? So the Gemara says there are three things that Yaharog va'al Yavor, you should be killed before you do them. And these are the three, right? So if someone came up to me and I was standing next to someone and they said, Yael, if you don't kill that person, I will kill you. I should allow myself to be killed, right? That's sort of like where the martyr culture of, I can't think of what it was. All of a sudden it fled my mind, right? But there's this idea that we should allow ourselves to be killed instead of killing each other. But if someone said to me, yeah, I'll eat a cheeseburger or I'll kill you, you should eat the cheeseburger. So these are the three worst things, right? The three things that we should never do, even if it means sacrificing our own lives. And these are the things the rabbis are saying about Yishmael. And so I think it's almost, you could read it as like a code. Maybe they think it means these actual three things, maybe not, but maybe the reason they include Rabbi Yishmael, even though it's sort of a stretch, it's a little tenuous, is to say Yishmael was violating cardinal sins. Yishmael has done the worst things that we could imagine doing on some level or another. And I think that this is like the midrash we know and sometimes love and sometimes are uncomfortable with, right? Which is where the midrash really wants us to understand people as black and white. Yishmael is good or bad. Right? And so because he gets cast out by Sarah, who's one of the imahot, he must be bad. Right? And God, to be fair, reinforces Sarah's choice, right? Abraham asks what to do, and God says, send her out. And so there's something comforting when you're a child, right, to knowing good and bad, but it frustrated my father, and so I've inherited that frustration. And luckily, it frustrated Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai as well. Right, and what is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's frustration? To me, it seems obvious once I read it, but it hadn't occurred to me. He says, "Chas v'shalom sheyiyeh b'veito shel oto tzadik hahu kach." He says, God forbid that in this house of this righteous man, right, the house of Abraham, that anyone was doing these things. And right, I think what he's saying is Abraham might have run a big household, right? We know that there are a lot of support staff that came with his tent, but there's no way that his son was being an idol worshiper or a molester or a murderer, and that was passing by Abraham, right? Maybe he was telling unkind tales behind, closed doors. Maybe he was taunting Yishmael, but there's no way he was doing those Yitzchak. There's no way he was doing these three cardinal sins, and Abraham didn't notice. Right. And I think that that's an interesting point, right? I'd like to think Abraham had a wholesome tent amongst him, right? So what does Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai explain that the thing is? He says it's as straightforward as it seems in the psukim. Ela li'inyan Yerusha, right? Here also, the telling is sort of sweet. In the midrash about the grasshoppers, he's like a little more abrasive, Yishmael, right? But it says that he says, right? He says, I am the eldest, and so I will take the double portion, right? Typically, the eldest son gets a shnei chalakim, a double portion. That does sort of come down through Yevamot, through the Gemara into halacha. And so Yishmael was pointing out the more obvious, less midrashic, right, than what he was pointing out about Yitzchak's father and his lineage. He's saying, look, whether Yitzchak is born to Abraham or not, I am the firstborn. I am going to be the covenantal son. And then Sarah's words make a lot more sense, right? We'd like to think that if Yishmael was a murderer, Sarah wouldn't have to say, that son won't share in the inheritance. Why is she bringing that up? She would have said, he's a murderer, send him away, right? But if it's about the inheritance, that's what she's responding to, right? Yishmael is threatening to take away the inheritance she feels is due to her son. She wants to have the covenantal child. And so she says, no, he's not going to share the inheritance with me. So I think that the Rashbi, the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, his words, no wonder he prefers his words to that of Rabbi Akiva, right? I think what he's saying, and it's fair, is there's a limit to the interpretation the midrash can take, right? We can only color people in so far, right? There are few midrashim where the avot are bad people or have made bad choices, right? The midrash isn't comfortable pushing the envelope that far. But when it comes to sort of the more neutral characters, they are comfortable saying, coloring them in a bad way, because otherwise it's troublesome what the avot and the imahot do to them, right? And so I think Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's answer is sort of elegant in that, like the Sforno, it sort of plays with the emotional dynamic in a household that is filled with tension, filled with women who are unhappy with each other, right? Hagar becomes greater than her mistress, sort of confusing. Sarah feels like she's sort of cut out of that relationship, maybe feeling sure that Yitzchak should be the covenantal child instead of Yishmael. Yishmael feeling rightfully like, well, hold on a second, right? This was all sort of kosher. Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham to have a child so that he could fulfill the covenant. And then all of a sudden, when she has her own baby, right, then she suddenly changes her mind about Yishmael. And so you can imagine how Yishmael would feel. I think there's something very raw and sort of honest about this Yishmael. This is a Yishmael who is trying to hold on to what he thinks and maybe really rightfully is deserving to him. And so I like it both because it stops that sort of mad flow of like imagination that sometimes happens in the midrash, and also because I think that it feels like it fits into this dialogue. when I was talking about this with Will, he pointed out that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is actually not known for being a moderate character. Right, we read often around Lag BaOmer time about how he gets put in this cave for many years, and when he comes out, that he sets the world on fire, like his gaze is burning. And so it's not as though he's known for being moderate, which in some ways I think strengthens his argument. Right, he's not saying, look, always play the middle of the road. He's saying here, mitzachik means something obvious, right? And I've seen in a few places this idea that mitzachik is almost like being Yitzchak, Yitzchaking, Isaaking, right? However we want to say that Yishmael was sort of pretending to be Isaac. And I find that very compelling because we see sort of that turn of midah keneged midah when we get to Yitzchak's children, right? Because Yaakov tries to Esav. He's Esaving, right? When he tries to go get the bracha, he makes himself smell like the field, and he puts on those furry coats so that his arms feel hairy like Esav's. And so it's almost as though like it's not Yitzchak's fault. Maybe Yitzchak is maybe like a tragic character here, but when Yishmael tries to be Yitzchak and gets sent away, potentially to die in the desert. And so then what happens to Yitzchak? His own children play the same trick on him, where Yaakov tries to be Esav in order to get the bracha. And so I think that when we read that sort of more straightforward way, we see the harm that gets played out over the history of this nuclear family. Where we see again and again these brotherly disputes, and we see them really in the same way of like trying to be the brother you wish you were, right? It's opposite because Yishmael is the oldest, but he's trying to be maybe the more legitimate heir. And again, with it happens again with Yaakov and Esav a generation later. So, I don't know which one resonates the most for you, but I think it's an interesting idea to see the powerful way the midrash colors our own understanding of the text. And also when someone pumps the brakes on it and says, well, hold on, there's actually a straightforward reading, might not be as good a lesson, maybe, right? Because Yishmael does not become this evil person, but it's like, it's real and it's life, and that we have to sort of hold the text where it is. So.
Thanks. I actually think that it's even what you were saying, that sort of more simple, straightforward, that's just kind of the way it is, can be read to mean that, okay, this is just the setup. I mean, just the fact that Ishmael is playing out there and is there to that whole community, not just Sarah, is constantly going to raise the question of the inheritance. You know, I mean, and it's not, that doesn't make anybody the good or the bad guy. I mean, and that's just the fact. As long as he's there, it's just a setup. It's going to be a problem, right?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I think it's pretty understandable that way.
Yeah.
His presence and being there raises that question. He doesn't even have to be aggressive about asking. Seems to be, you know.
I like that. Mitzachik might just be like sort of playing in the public space.
Yeah, I mean, he's just playing there, and she's the mother of this other one, and so
yeah.
I mean, right.
Yeah, definitely. It kind of reminds me of when you read books about the slave period in America, right? When we know that lots of masters had slaves with their children with their slaves, right? That like the lighter skinned children were hidden when other people came by, right? Like you didn't want them sort of out in the public space. And maybe that's that same idea, right? Yishmael is the child of the slave, and it's like a little uncomfortable. It doesn't feel like the right way. And we have to grapple with that, right? And I think that's sort of what's powerful about it, is like then it becomes harder to justify Sarah's behavior. Why couldn't we make space for both of them? If not, why couldn't Sarah and Abraham say, look, Yishmael, like this is your lot in life. You're the son of the concubine, not of the Ima, right? But we'd love you for you to stay and be a child here, right? But it was too uncomfortable, and Sarah wasn't able to find that, compassion. Yeah. It's powerful.
I'm thinking of Joseph and Yaakov and the brothers.
Yeah. And that one's an interesting one because, right, the nuance of like the starkness of the concubine falls away. right? Because Leah's children are obviously equal rights inheritors, but certainly Yaakov seems to prefer the eldest child of his loved wife, right? And in fact, I don't remember if I did it as a parsha class. I might have done it as a parsha class about there's it's towards the end of the Torah, before I think it was before Simchat Torah. There's a law that says that if you have a loved wife and a hated wife, and the hated wife gives you a child first, they are the inheritor, and you can't let your feelings about the mom sway your inheritance division. And in fact, commentators note that it almost is as though Yaakov did the opposite, right? Reuven is the eldest child of the hated wife, and Yosef is the eldest child of the loved wife, and Yosef ends up getting a double inheritance because both of his children get a portion, Manasseh and Ephraim, right? And so there's sort of like a danger towards letting your love, which can be sort of unfair and exclusive, guide your division of your properties. And Yosef really highlights that, right, in a way that is more than here, because here we can sort of say, well, Yishmael was Hagar's son, but with Yosef it's a little bit harder. Yeah. Yeah, certainly. I mean, it keeps playing out and out and out. There's something about the one who shish kebabbed the people. His name is escaping me all of a sudden. Much later in Shemot, Pinchas, right? Pinchas gets the Brit Shalom. Maybe I'll find that. We can do that as a parsha class. It's in Parshat Pinchas probably, or maybe the one right before, because I think that's, Pinchas gets a Brit Shalom for killing the Midianite woman and the man in the camp. And people say, well, why did he get that? It seems like he sort of had this vigilante justice. And one of the reasons has to do with this reverberating sort of choosing. I forget which man comes from which camp, but there was like the 12 tribes sort of set up a family pattern that had been established for them that reverberated long into Bnei Israel's future. That was not very clear. I'll have to find the example for you. But I think that we can see it go in both directions, right? And certainly this might be the makor, right? The foundational experience where Yitzchak, right, sees Sarah say, presumably sees Sarah say to Abraham, cast him out, and then Yishmael's gone. And actually, in next week's parsha, one of my favorite moments, sort of like the most poignant moments, is when Abraham dies. It says that Yishmael and Yitzchak bury him together, and there's no other information. And you'd think if Yishmael was a murderer, child molester, idol worshiper, that perhaps he wouldn't have been welcome back, right? But somehow the two brothers could find a way to come together to bury a father that presumably they both respected or honored, or however we want to think about that. Which again, just like lends like a real life color, when you hear of like people who, have feuds in their family for years, but they come together back to a funeral, like it might not have been comfortable, they might not have gotten along, but they were able to discharge their familial obligation together, which I think does say something about how good or bad Yishmael was on some level.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Have a great week, and I'll see you next week. Shabbat shalom.
Right.